drew this building in Edinburgh, and here it is 2.5 years ago. It was one of the very first drawings I did for a YouTube drawing video. And I got to thinking, I wonder how much my drawing style has changed. Besides the fact that I draw smaller, how has it changed to when I drew this? And the only way to really know is to draw it again. And so I'm drawing what was once a church on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, which is now the Royal Mile Markets building. I've got the same reference, and again I'm drawing freehand in pen. Now I'm using a 0.2mm pen, which I'm pretty certain is a slightly lighter nib width than the one I used earlier, which was a different brand of pen as well. I start in what I think was the place I started in the other one. I think I started at the base of the tower. Now, while I'm still happy with that as a starting point, I don't think what I went on to do served me well in this drawing, because from here I went up rather than coming down. The problem with going up first is that there's less on the paper, and so I'm trying to work out the heights of these sections of the spire without any real reference except for what I've just drawn below. Whereas if I'd drawn the whole building first, I could have referenced the whole building and the overall effect. So I think my tower ended up being the upper part slightly too large. At the end, we'll compare the two side by side, and I'll highlight some particular differences that I've noticed. Having decided to go up, I commit to it. I did have trouble working out the height for these columns, and the two end ones I should have just brought in slightly, just tucked in 1mm. Now, in this photo, the tower is affected by the lens distortion, and I didn't want to add that. That's why my lines go straight up, because that was the effect in life. Look, I must apologize for my hair coming into the camera view. This is the first time I've used a new stand, and it actually allows me to get my head in front of the camera. That wasn't possible with the stand I was using before, because if I did, I used to whack the phone with my forehead. Unfortunately, it catches the autofocus sometimes. I'm trying to, at this point, keep the proportions correct. I'm trying to particularly put the depth lines in. This is an unfamiliar size for me to draw now. I would probably normally draw this half the size, probably about the size of the reference, in fact, the reference photo. But I wanted to keep it as close to my drawing 2.5 years ago as possible. Keeping all the verticals vertical is the most crucial thing with a steeple, and getting the alignment worked out and getting the perspective distortions of the side that's facing away at a steeper angle as correct as possible. Things such as the arches of the windows and so forth. This section I've just drawn is slightly too large, slightly too wide, and then that means that the cap that I stick on top of it is, I think, slightly too large. It's not so much the height, but I think it's just too wide. Always try and locate the top of the spire with the details that are beneath it, and that's what I'm trying to do now. And I didn't bring my lines in close enough, and therefore I had to extend it. Having a quick look at how did I do this before? Sorry about that head. I will work out a way that I can make sure I don't do that in future videos. Now I know that I didn't do too much detail with this at the time. I remember thinking, oh, it's really a bit complicated. all the street level stuff here. So I did make it simpler because in my mind at the time, I thought that the spire was the focus. It was really what I wanted to draw. And I just drew the rest of the building to keep it supported upright, I suppose. But I think it explains why my earlier drawing, the lower section, is even briefer in terms of line and detail than certainly what I did today. Here, I'm trying to tackle this as I'm tackling any drawing that I'm currently doing, and I'm trying to put marks on the paper that will capture the effect of what we're looking at. When I was doing the earlier drawing, I was very much more focused on lines to define shapes, to outline shapes, and to get the line straight and the shapes in proportion. But I wasn't particularly at all really thinking of marks, and I wasn't thinking of creating effects. I was still thinking of outlining forms and shapes. But of course, in a subject such as this, certainly in the upper part of the drawing, there are lots of lines. So it's not unsuited, but there are still places where we need to create effects of architecture. Add in these lower details. Some people. Crowds aren't my favourite. They're certainly not my specialty, but if we're going to do street scenes, we do need to know how to populate our street in a credible way. We need to develop a certain way of capturing the effect of people for the sort of distance we're going to have them in our drawing. It's not that we have to learn to do portraiture to be able to put them in our streets. We need to work out a way which for us is possible and looks effective. It wasn't so much that it was a complex building as it wasn't a very clear reference to see, but the building does seem to be stained in different ways, the sandstone, and I don't know whether that's because it hasn't been completely cleaned last time it was cleaned, or I don't know, but it was quite difficult to exactly work out what was happening in that right hand front section because it's not symmetrical. There's only a pilaster on one side. It wasn't straightforward all the time. Doing some of these people. I placed this figure here, thinking that was going to be the closest figure, but in a few minutes, you'll see me add a closer figure again. I just wanted to bring the plane of depth forward a little bit, and in a scene such as this, add in a closer person is a great way of doing that, as long as we've got space to put them without having lines of other things go right through them. Now I'm looking at this right-hand side section. I did this very, very sparsely in the original. It's like I didn't want to draw it at all. It's interesting, with 2.5 years and around 500 videos, just how much more I am aware of process and intent when I put my lines on the paper. Still not perfect, but there's something about teaching it when you're actually putting it into practice all the time as well. Well, not so much teaching it as simply verbalizing it, talking out loud the process that I'm following, that I think really helps to entrench it in our thinking, in my thinking. I have, I'm sure, far more consciousness of what I'm doing all the time than I had 2.5 years ago. But we would hope that in that length of time and with that many drawings that we would actually have developed our skills, picked up some more skills or some new skills. Here we have the two drawings side by side. What do you think? Today's drawing is slightly larger. And at the very end, I'll just pop on a screen save of the two drawings side by side, but adjusted to look pretty much the same size. I think will help show any comparison more accurately. Really, in the first drawing, it's a lot more two-dimensional feeling. I mean, it is obviously a three-dimensional shape. There are boxes, but with the decorative elements, they're highly simplified, and there's not always adequate depth lines. Today's clocks are probably just a little bit ahead of the clocks 2.5 years ago. I think it's the street level where perhaps the greater confidence and experience that I've had in drawing shows itself most. I've put the car in, I didn't leave it out. I put people in, I'd put extra people in. And I think that works really nicely. So here we have the two drawings, 2.5 years and 500 videos, teaching videos on drawing apart. Is there more or less of a difference between the two? What were you expecting? For me, the most obvious difference is my preparedness to draw more detail, to capture more detail. And I think my focus now on using marks rather than lines and seeking to capture the effect, particularly below the towers, below the spires, is evident. A much more simplified version on the left 2.5 years ago, and not as many lines to create the sense of depth that we have. And I think the fact that 2.5 years ago my thinking wasn't as developed, nearly as developed, about marks versus lines shows, and there is far more of an emphasis in that first earlier drawing of drawing lines, quite definite lines, outlining and capturing shape and form in simple black lines. And I'm not sure it creates as interesting an effect as what I've done on the right, the way I think now of lines and marks. And in fact, lines are a form of marks, and sometimes they're the best marks to use and sometimes not. And suggesting the buildings on the far side, particularly that building closest with the 4 columns out the front, it helps to, although it's not part of the same building, visually it just helps to anchor the tower a little bit. And the same going further on the right with the tree. And adding that figure just helps to bring the depth of plane closer to us and creates more distance. And even more so with that post on the lower left-hand side does the same thing. I probably should have actually hatched it a bit darker just to draw attention to it a bit more. So 2.5 years apart, I think there is a change, there is a development, and I'm certainly happy with it. I think the tower, the upper part of today's tower, is just a little bit too wide, just a little bit too tall. But I've learned a good lesson in drawing strategy through doing this. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. It was certainly very interesting for me. But I hope it's encouraging that if we persevere and we're very intentional about what we do and we're regular with what we do in our drawing, that real improvement at whatever level we're at is possible. And if you've got some of your earlier drawings around, why not have another go drawing it if you've still got the original reference? And compare the two. See how your drawing has changed. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.